So these are the two things to keep in mind. Hydrostatic pressure depends on water or how much volume you've got in the blood. Osmotic pressure depends on sites and proteins in the blood. Here's problem number 1. Let's talk about the top left corner and what happens if BHP decreases. Let's say that you've got a person who is taking a diuretic. What does a diuretic do to you?
Release urine.
Makes you urinate, yeah. Release urine. Of course, urine is largely water, right? So which of these two values do we mostly affect? BHP. Okay, so here's our first scenario. At your arterial end, if BHP is normal, meaning it exceeds BOP, you're going to successfully push out the fluid into the surrounding capillary space. But what if you're on a diuretic and you're not pushing out enough fluid? What if your net filtration pressure drops, meaning that you have hydrostatic pressure that is no longer greater than osmotic pressure? Are you going to be successful in pushing out enough fluid? No. Okay. So here's the problem. All that fluid that was out here in the interstitial space is staying in the capillary, right?
Blood pressure and everything.
Yeah, so you're going to lose that fluid ultimately as urine. So if you no longer have fluids out here, the sites that are currently sitting in your surrounding cells, in this interstitial space, becomes more concentrated than the cells themselves. What happens to a cell when you place it in an area that's more concentrated? They shrivel. Yeah, so if you're losing hydrostatic pressure, the cells shrivel because instead of having a lot of fluid out here to wash around those cells, the fluid actually stays in the bloodstream. Cells will shrivel when placed in a hypertonic situation, and that's what you're essentially doing here. So the fluid is going to move out of your cell. Where does that fluid ultimately end up?
In the capillary.
In the capillary, because what do diuretics do? Yes, take more water out of you. So if you take a diuretic, this is how you actually pull fluid from your cells into the surrounding hypertonic interstitial space. And that fluid, of course, then will move into the bloodstream and be carried off by the urine. So anytime you decrease BHP, anytime you decrease blood pressure in terms of decreasing the amount of volume in your blood, you're going to shrivel the cells. Why do those cells shrivel? You're losing fluid, and what has happened to the solute concentration around those cells? Become higher than the cell. So just by not giving your interstitial space enough fluid, that creates a hypertonic solution around your cells. So anything that promotes loss of blood volume, say through a diuretic, for instance, hemorrhage, things like that that create loss of blood volume, all promote dehydration in the cells. So cell shriveling promotes dehydration. Wouldn't you expect that from a diuretic anyway? So all we're looking at here is just the background of why you actually experience dehydration. If you're currently taking something like a diuretic, if you're experiencing a hemorrhage, if for whatever reason you're losing blood volume, now you see that the cells actually become, they're losing fluid to the hypertonic solution around them. That moves the fluid into the bloodstream and carries it off. Does this make any sense at all? A little bit. Okay. Let's try another box on there. Let's talk about the top right-hand box where it says BOP. Let's try and see what happens if BOP decreases. Okay, this is a review for us. At the arterial end, hydrostatic pressure has to be higher than osmotic pressure. So what if osmotic pressure decreases at this end? You're still going to push fluids out, right? So no big deal for pushing fluids out. Osmotic pressure is a big deal at the venial end because now you have to return that fluid through reabsorption back into the capillary. So if you lose osmotic pressure, you have lost solutes or proteins or both, so you no longer have the pressure necessary to pull fluids back in from the surrounding tissue space. So let's take a look and see what happens if you lose BOP. Okay, so you're going to be doing filtration, right? You're not going to be capable of doing reabsorption, so where does all that fluid stay?
Tissue.
Cells and tissue. So all of this area out here is now surrounded by dilute, hypotonic solution. Anytime you have cells in a hypotonic solution, they float. We call that process of swelling edema. Fluid actually stays in the interstitial space because it's filtered out and it cannot be reabsorbed back in. So all the fluid is floating out here in the interstitial space. So we cannot do reabsorption. Since BOP is a problem, we have to look here at conditions that could promote loss of solutes or proteins. Boy, look at the list here on page 132. Hyponatremia means low BOP, cells swell. Hypertonic drift. We know from Bio 210 that hypotonic drift makes cells swell. This is how it makes them swell. You filter the fluid and you don't reabsorb it. Nephrosis. Loss of proteins in the urine. Infections. Proteins are in the interstitial space, actually pulling the fluids and keeping them out there. So you'll notice that most of these situations here are actually created by changing the osmosis setup. In other words, we're changing the number of solutes or proteins that we have, mainly in the bloodstream. So if you lose that BOP, then you can't reclaim enough fluid back in, so the cells swell due to all the excess fluid in the interstitial space. Does that condition make sense to you?
I thought burns cause dehydration.
They do, but then of course there's protein loss. So you've got actually multiple ones of these that you can categorize burns, say, as loss of BHT as well. So you've got this issue of, are you dehydrating, are you swelling? You're actually doing both. Yeah, so that's a good point. Hey, even diarrhea is not just loss of